Hey guys, the strange thing about waking up cold in medieval Europe is that it was not always a sign of poverty in the way we might imagine. Cold was not just outside the door. It was built into the walls, the floor, the bedding, the clothing, the workday, and even the idea of what comfort was supposed to mean. Before we step into that world, tell me where you're watching from and what part of history you'd like to hear next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history told calmly, leaving a like is a simple way to support it. And if you want more quietly fascinating history for evenings, sleep, or background listening, you're warmly invited to subscribe. So let's begin in the dark, before sunrise, inside a medieval room where the first thing a person feels is not the romance of the past, but the cold. For many people in medieval Europe, morning did not begin with a gentle stretch into warmth. It began with the body noticing the air before the mind was fully awake. The face might be cold first, then the hands, then the feet, especially if they had slipped out from under rough wool or linen during the night. The room itself held the chill like a container. Stone, packed earth, timber, plaster, and thatch did not behave like modern insulated walls. They did not keep indoor life sealed away from the season. They merely softened it a little and sometimes not very much. This is one of the first things modern viewers often misunderstand about medieval cold. We tend to imagine the past as a world without central heating, and that is true, but it does not quite explain the feeling. The real difference was not simply the absence of a modern radiator or furnace. It was the entire relationship between the human body and the environment. Medieval people lived much closer to weather. Wind had more ways to enter. Damp had more time to settle. Smoke, ash, mud, animal warmth, body heat, and fire all mixed together in the same domestic world. Comfort was not a stable background condition. It had to be created, protected, and often shared. A person waking in a peasant household might open their eyes in a room that had gone cold during the night because the hearth fire had burned low. Keeping a fire alive required fuel, and fuel meant labor. Wood had to be gathered, cut, stored, dried, guarded, purchased, or negotiated. In some regions, especially where woodland access was limited, fuel could be a serious household concern. It was not something to waste simply because morning was unpleasant. A fire that warmed the room through the night also consumed precious material, and so many households accepted a colder darkness in exchange for having enough fuel for cooking, work, and the next evening. That practical calculation shaped the way people slept. It shaped when they rose. It shaped where they placed their beds or pallets. It shaped how close animals were kept, how many bodies shared a room, and how thickly clothing was layered before sleep. To us, the idea of wearing day clothes or multiple coverings in bed may sound uncomfortable. To them, it could be ordinary sense. The night was not a separate zone of comfort. It was another part of the day's struggle to keep the body functioning. In poorer homes, the floor might be earth-beaten hard by years of footsteps, sometimes covered with rushes, straw, or other materials that could soften the surface and absorb mess. These coverings helped, but they could also hold dampness, smells, and insects. Bedding varied widely. Some had straw mattresses, sacks filled with chaff, wool blankets, cloaks, skins, or linen sheets if the household could afford them. Others made do with whatever could trap enough warmth to get through the night. A bed was not always a private object. It might be shared by siblings, parents and children, servants, travelers, or workers. Privacy was less important than heat, space, and survival. And yet, even shared warmth could be complicated. More bodies meant more heat, but also more movement, noise, breath, fleas, damp clothing, and interrupted sleep. A crowded sleeping space could protect against cold while making rest less peaceful. That is one of the quiet ironies of medieval domestic life. The very thing that helped people endure the cold could also make the night feel restless. Warmth was often bought with discomfort. The cold itself was not the same across Europe, of course. Medieval Europe stretched from the damp Atlantic edges of Britain and Ireland to the Alpine valleys, the Low Countries, the forests and fields of Central Europe, the colder north, and the milder but still seasonally harsh Mediterranean regions. A winter morning in a stone house in northern England did not feel exactly like a winter morning in rural Tuscany, and a farmhouse in Scandinavia had its own adaptations. But across much of Europe, especially in the long colder months, waking cold was not unusual. It was part of the rhythm of ordinary life. The medieval day often began before full light, especially when work demanded it. In winter, darkness lingered. In summer, dawn came early, and labor could begin with the light. The sound that stirred a person might be a rooster, a church bell, a child, an animal, a master calling, or simply the knowledge that lying still did not remove the tasks waiting outside the bedding. The first challenge was leaving whatever warmth had gathered around the body. The second was moving into air that felt sharper than the place just left behind. That moment must have been familiar to countless people. The hesitation before rising, the brief calculation of whether the fire could be stirred back to life, the search for shoes or clogs, the stiffness of fingers, the unpleasant touch of cold fabric, the thin line between sleep and labor. Medieval life often asked the body to move before it felt ready. This does not mean medieval people were helpless in the face of cold. They had knowledge, habits, and technologies suited to their world. They layered clothing carefully. Wool was central because it retained warmth better than many alternatives and remained useful even when damp. Linen undergarments could be worn beneath heavier garments. Cloaks, hoods, caps, mittens, hose, and wrapped feet all mattered. People understood drafts. They knew where warmth gathered. They knew the value of shutters, hangings, bedding, straw, and shared space. They did not lack intelligence. They lacked the industrial systems that make modern warmth cheap, constant, and invisible. And that is where the history becomes more interesting. Cold in medieval Europe was not merely a weather problem. It was a social problem, an economic problem, and a design problem. It exposed rank. It revealed access to land and fuel. It separated those who could choose warmth from those who had to ration it. It shaped architecture from castles to cottages. It influenced diet, clothing, labor, and even the emotional texture of home. A noble household, for example, might seem at first to offer an escape from the cold. Castles and manor houses had larger hearths, more servants, better bedding, wall hangings, private chambers, and greater access to fuel. A wealthy person could sleep in a raised bed, behind curtains under multiple layers with a servant to prepare the fire. But stone buildings, especially large ones, could be brutally cold. Their walls stored chill. Their halls were high and difficult to heat. Windows, even when glazed, did not seal warmth as modern windows do. Fireplaces warmed zones, not whole buildings. A person could stand near flames and still feel the cold behind them. This is one of the expectation reversals that matters. Wealth improved comfort, but it did not create modern comfort. A lord or lady might have better protection from cold than a field laborer, but they still lived in buildings where heat was local, temporary, and uneven. The medieval rich could gather warmth around themselves. They could not always command it everywhere. Comfort was concentrated near beds, hearths, tapestries, clothing, and bodies. For the poor, the problem was harsher because every solution had a cost. Better bedding cost money or labor. Better clothing required wool, linen, leather, or skill. Fuel required rights, tools, time, or purchase. Even the layout of the home reflected limits. A small, smoky room could be unpleasant, but it was easier to heat than a larger space. Smoke from an open hearth could irritate the eyes and lungs, blacken beams, and cling to clothing. Yet that same hearth cooked food, dried garments, gave light, discouraged damp, and offered the center of household life. The fire was both comfort and burden. In many early medieval and rural houses, the hearth was open, sometimes placed centrally, with smoke escaping through a hole, a louver, gaps in the roof, or simply drifting upward and out where it could. Chimneys became more common over time, especially in wealthier buildings, but they did not instantly transform ordinary domestic life. The absence of a modern chimney could mean warmth stayed lower and smoke wandered through the room. The presence of a chimney could improve air but also draw heat away. Every arrangement had trade-offs. Imagine waking before dawn and seeing only the faint remains of embers. Someone had banked the fire the night before, covering it carefully to preserve a living core. If the embers survived, the morning could begin with coaxing. A little air, a little dry kindling, careful patience. If they had died, relighting was more trouble. Fire was not something to take for granted. The ability to preserve it overnight mattered, especially when tools for making flame required effort and skill. This small domestic act reveals a larger truth. Medieval cold was managed through routines. The household survived because people repeated small acts at the right times. They closed shutters. They dried wood. They shook out bedding. They turned garments. They repaired cracks. They stored food. They kept animals close or separate according to need. They rose when work required it. The cold morning was not a single event. It was the result of countless systems quietly succeeding or failing. And when the body finally left bed, the room offered no easy comfort. Feet met a cold floor. Breath might be visible in the dim air. The first clothing of the day might not feel warm until the body had worn it for several minutes. If garments had been damp from work, rain, snow, or washing, the discomfort increased. Dryness mattered almost as much as warmth. Damp wool, damp straw, damp walls, and damp shoes could make a moderate cold feel much worse. Medieval Europe was not only cold in winter because temperatures dropped. It was cold because dampness traveled. Rain seeped into roads, fields, roofs, clothing, and bedding. Mud clung to footwear. Mist settled in valleys. Rivers and marshes shaped local climates. In some places, winter was less about clean white snow and more about wet chill, the kind that gets into sleeves, hems, and joints. The body could be chilled not by a dramatic storm but by ordinary moisture that never fully disappeared. For workers, this mattered deeply. A person might wake cold, dress in cold garments, eat something simple if food was available, and step outside into labor that did not wait for comfort. Agricultural work changed with the seasons, but there was always something. Animals had to be fed. Water had to be carried. Tools had to be handled. Wood had to be moved. Fields, gardens, barns, dairies, kitchens, and workshops all had demands. In towns, apprentices, servants, bakers, brewers, smiths, porters, washerwomen, and many others faced their own cold routines. A baker's morning might begin near heat, but not in leisure. Ovens had to be managed long before others wanted bread. A blacksmith had fire, but also early labor, smoke, hard surfaces, and exposure when moving between spaces. A washerwoman might work with water that made cold not just an atmosphere but a physical contact. A stable hand might be near animals and straw, but also manure, dampness, and freezing outdoor tasks. Warmth existed in pockets, often tied to labor rather than rest. This is why the phrase "waking up cold" opens into more than a bedroom scene. It leads into an entire system of work and survival. Morning cold was not always something people could fix before beginning the day. Often, the work itself was the only path toward warmth. Moving the body, tending animals, carrying fuel, kneading dough, stirring pots, sweeping, walking, and lifting could generate heat. In this sense, the medieval morning reversed a modern expectation. Today, we often warm ourselves before work. Many medieval people had to work themselves into warmth. Food also played a part. A warm meal or drink could change the morning, but not everyone had it immediately. Pottage, ale, bread, leftovers, cheese, onions, or other simple foods might begin the day depending on region, season, status, and household. Ale and small beer were common in many places, not as a morning luxury in the modern sense, but as part of ordinary diet and hydration where water quality and custom varied. Warm pottage could be deeply comforting, but it required fuel and preparation. Again, comfort depended on systems already in motion. The church bell added another layer to time. Medieval mornings were not measured only by clocks, which were rare for much of the period and developed unevenly. Time was often marked by light, labor, bells, prayer, and obligation. Monastic communities had their own intense relationship with cold and waking. Monks might rise during the night for prayer, leaving beds for cold stone spaces, cloisters, chapels, and chants before dawn. Their discomfort was shaped by discipline, devotion, and institutional routine. For them, cold could be interpreted through spiritual practice. For a peasant or servant, it was more likely a practical condition to be endured. But in both cases, the cold body belonged to a world where comfort was not the highest organizing principle. Modern people sometimes imagine medieval people as simply tougher than us. There is a little truth in the sense that they were habituated to discomforts many of us rarely face. But calling them tougher can flatten the history. They were not made of different material. They felt cold. They complained, adapted, suffered, joked, endured, and sought relief. They valued warmth. They noticed good bedding, good fires, dry socks, thick cloaks, and sheltered rooms. The difference is that their expectations were trained by scarcity and repetition. What we might treat as a failure of housing or infrastructure was, for them, an ordinary limit of life. That does not make the past romantic. It makes it human. A medieval person waking cold was not living in a storybook scene of candlelight and rustic charm. They were living inside a world where the body was constantly negotiating with materials. Stone, wool, wood, straw, iron, leather, clay, smoke, water, and wind all had roles in the day. The household was a technology, but a fragile one. It worked only when tended. Even the bed, which might seem like the most private object in the morning, was part of status and survival. In wealthier households, beds could be valuable possessions, sometimes listed in wills and inventories. A proper bed with hangings could create a small enclosed climate, trapping body heat and reducing drafts. Curtains around a bed were not merely decorative. They were practical. They made a room within a room. They offered privacy but also warmth. In a large chamber, a curtained bed could mean the difference between tolerable sleep and a night spent exposed to currents of cold air. For ordinary people, bedding might be far simpler, but the principle was the same. The body needed a nest. Straw, wool, cloaks, and shared blankets formed barriers against the room. Anything that trapped air could help. But bedding also aged. Straw compressed. Blankets wore thin. Lice and fleas found places to live. Damp could creep in. A bed that saved warmth might also hold the signs of hard living. And then there was clothing. Medieval clothing was not fashion alone. It was environmental equipment. Layers mattered. Covering the head mattered. A hood was not just a dramatic medieval silhouette. It was a practical response to cold, rain, and wind. Woolen hose helped protect the legs. Cloaks could be wrapped and rearranged. Belts allowed garments to be adjusted for labor. Footwear varied, but cold feet were a serious problem in a world of mud, frost, and limited drying. The morning often began with the work of assembling protection around the body. For many women, the cold morning also included domestic labor before or alongside other work. Fire had to be managed, children tended, food prepared, animals checked, dairy tasks done, water brought, cloth handled, floors swept, and household needs anticipated. Men's work and women's work varied by region, class, season, and household, but the cold entered both. It did not respect the division of labor. It touched the hands that milked, kneaded, chopped, spun, carried, hammered, and washed. Children, too, learned cold early. A child in a medieval household might wake among siblings, near parents, or in a servant's space if they were placed in another household for work or training. Childhood was not insulated from domestic discomfort. Smaller bodies lose heat more easily, and yet children were expected gradually to join the routines that kept the household functioning. The cold morning was part of education, though not in a classroom sense. It taught where the firewood was, how to dress quickly, which corners of the room were drafty, how to keep out of the way, and when silence was wiser than complaint. Animals could make a household warmer and messier at the same time. In some rural arrangements, livestock might be kept close to the human living area or under the same roof, depending on local architecture and need. Their bodies gave heat. Their presence also brought smells, noise, insects, and labor. A cow, pig, goat, sheep, or chickens nearby changed the feeling of morning. Before the human household was fully awake, animals might already be shifting, breathing, calling, or needing care. The boundary between domestic life and agricultural life was often thin. This closeness to animals is one of those details that modern viewers may find strange, but it made practical sense. Heat mattered, security mattered, space mattered, theft mattered, weather mattered. A structure that sheltered both humans and animals could be efficient, even if it was unpleasant. Medieval people were not arranging their homes according to modern ideas of cleanliness, privacy, and smell. They were making decisions inside a harsher economy of survival. As the morning widened and the first light reached the edges of the room, the cold did not simply vanish. Sunlight could be weak. Windows were limited. In poorer homes, openings might be small to reduce drafts, which also reduced light. In wealthier homes, glass existed but was expensive and still far from modern insulation. Shutters could block weather but also darkness. To let in light might be to let in cold. To keep out cold might be to live dimly. Again, comfort was a trade-off. And this trade-off helps explain the emotional atmosphere of medieval mornings. They were not necessarily miserable every day in a dramatic sense. People could laugh, work, pray, sing, gossip, complain, and take pleasure in small comforts. But the baseline was different. The body began the day aware of limits. Warmth was not assumed. Dryness was not guaranteed. Privacy was not expected. Light was precious. Fuel was valuable. The day's first movements were shaped by necessity more than preference. By the time a household was fully awake, the cold had already organized its hierarchy. Whoever rose first often faced the worst of it. Someone had to leave warmth before others. Someone had to stir embers, fetch water, open shutters, tend animals, prepare food, and begin labor. In many homes, that someone was not the most powerful person in the room. Servants, women, apprentices, children, or lower-status workers often absorbed discomfort so that others could rise into a slightly more prepared world. That small fact reveals something larger about medieval society. Comfort was not distributed evenly. The cold did not just descend from the sky. It moved through rank. The wealthier could command labor. The poorer supplied it. The master might wake to a fire already revived. The servant woke to revive it. The lord might enter a hall where preparations had begun. The kitchen workers had already endured the early chill. The monk might shiver in discipline. The lay worker might shiver because there was no choice. Cold was natural, but the way it was experienced was social. And as we keep moving through this medieval morning, that social pattern becomes harder to ignore. The cold room is only the beginning. Outside the door were lanes, fields, yards, barns, wells, workshops, churches, mills, and markets, each with its own kind of morning discomfort. The world beyond the bed did not offer a clean escape from cold. It revealed how deeply cold shaped the entire day, from the first handful of embers to the first steps into mud, frost, smoke, and work. The first steps into mud, frost, smoke, and work were often the point where the household's private cold became part of a much larger public world. A person could leave a room that felt cramped and smoky, only to enter a lane where the air was sharper, the ground less forgiving, and the day's obligations already seemed to be waiting in the dark. The cold was no longer just in the bedding or the floor. It was in the latch of the door, the handle of the bucket, the stones underfoot, the rope of the well, the breath of animals, and the silence of fields before the sun had done much to soften them. For many ordinary people, one of the first tasks of the morning was water. It is easy to say that simply, but carrying water in the cold could be a miserable beginning to the day. Water was heavy. Wells, streams, pumps, springs, or communal sources might be close, or they might require a walk. The ground could be slick, rutted, frozen, or thick with mud. Hands could stiffen around a wooden pail. Clothing could brush against wet surfaces. A spilled bucket did not mean inconvenience only. It meant doing the work again with colder hands, wetter hems, and less patience. And water was everywhere in medieval life, not as comfort, but as demand. It was needed for cooking, brewing, washing, animals, dairying, cleaning, and countless small domestic tasks. Yet it rarely arrived conveniently. There was no tap beside the hearth. A household's morning warmth could depend on someone first going into the cold to bring back what was needed for the fire, the pot, the animals, or the people still inside. In that way, even the hope of warmth could begin with an act of exposure. The same was true of fuel. A revived fire required more than embers. It needed kindling, wood, peat, charcoal, brushwood, or whatever fuel was common and available in that place. In some regions, peat was cut and dried. In others, wood was gathered under rites that could be carefully controlled. Fallen branches, hedgerow cuttings, coppiced wood, and scraps all had value. A person might step out into the cold not to escape the house, but to make the house livable for the next hour. Fuel also tells us something important about medieval inequality. The poor could be cold because they had little fuel, but they could also be cold because they had to spend bodily energy getting it. The wealthy consumed fuel through the labor of others. Great halls, kitchens, chambers, and workshops might burn through enormous quantities of wood, and the warmth of higher status spaces depended on people whose own mornings may have begun in frost and darkness. Behind every comfortable hearth was a chain of work. Cutting, hauling, stacking, drying, lighting, tending, clearing ash, and beginning again. Outside the home, footwear mattered immediately. Medieval shoes were usually leather, and while they could be well made, they were not modern insulated boots. The soles could be thin by modern standards. Pattens, wooden overshoes, could lift the foot above mud and filth in towns, and in some settings they were extremely useful. But ordinary movement in cold weather still meant managing wet ground, slippery surfaces, and the slow creep of moisture. Cold feet could follow a person through the day, especially if shoes became damp early and there was little chance to dry them properly. This is one of the quiet details that changes how we imagine medieval work. A field, road, market, or workshop was not just a place where labor happened. It was a surface pressing against the body. Mud tugged at shoes. Frost made paths treacherous. Snow concealed holes and ruts. Wet straw clung. Stone yards held cold. Wooden thresholds became slick. A person's energy was spent not only on the official task, but on remaining upright, keeping balance, protecting tools, watching footing, and preserving whatever dryness remained. In rural areas, the morning might draw people toward animals first. Livestock could not be paused because the weather was bad. Cows needed milking. Horses and oxen needed feeding, grooming, harnessing, or checking. Sheep, pigs, goats, and poultry brought their own routines. Animal care in winter carried a particular pressure, because the survival of the household often depended on the survival of the animals. A cold cow, an injured horse, a hungry pig, or a weak lamb could become an economic problem as much as a domestic concern. The warmth of animals could be real, but it was not gentle comfort in the modern sentimental sense. It came with wet hides, breath steaming in the air, dung underfoot, hay to move, doors to open, and hands pushed into unpleasant work before the fingers were fully awake. A person might lean into the side of an animal and feel life and heat there, but that same animal had to be managed, fed, cleaned around, and protected. Warmth did not remove labor. It usually announced it. For agricultural workers, winter did not mean the fields were empty of duty. The great rhythms of plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, threshing, and haymaking varied by season and region, but there were always tasks around the margins. Hedges needed attention. Ditches needed clearing. Tools needed repair. Grain needed threshing. Animals needed bedding. Wood needed cutting. Manure needed moving. In colder weather, some kinds of fieldwork slowed, but the household economy did not stop. The medieval year changed its demands rather than releasing people from them. The plow team, when it went out, offered another kind of cold morning. Oxen or horses had to be readied. Harness, yokes, ropes, and tools had to be handled. Earth might be heavy, wet, or resistant. A plowman's body warmed through effort, but the first part of the work could be punishing. Before the rhythm settled, there was the stiffness of tools, animals, hands, and ground. The cold did not disappear. It was pushed back by motion. And this is one of the deeper truths about cold in medieval Europe. Movement was often the only reliable heating system available to the poor. To sit still was to grow colder. To work was to suffer differently. The body had to choose between the discomfort of exposure and the discomfort of exertion. A person cutting wood, carrying dung, hauling water, grinding grain, or walking behind animals might eventually feel heat under the layers, but that warmth was earned through fatigue. Could be lost quickly when the work paused. In towns, the cold morning took different forms. Streets could be narrow, shadowed, and dirty. Buildings leaned close. Sunlight might reach the ground late, if at all. Workshops opened onto the street or into cramped interiors. Apprentices and servants might be among the first awake, preparing fires, sweeping, carrying water, setting out materials, opening shutters, or readying goods. The town offered more trades, more movement, and more noise, but not necessarily more comfort. A baker's shop might glow with heat, yet the heat belonged to production. Dough had to be mixed, ovens fired, loaves handled, customers served. The baker's warmth came with early hours and constant attention. A brewer worked around liquids, vessels, steam, grain, and fuel. A smith stood near intense fire but also endured extremes. Heat on the face, cold at the back, chilled metal, drafty openings, and labor that began before the town had fully stirred. A tanner, fuller, dyer, or washer could face cold water, strong smells, and wet hands as part of ordinary work. The more one looks at medieval labor, the less simple warmth becomes. Some trades were hot, but not comfortable. Some were indoors but not protected. Some involved fire but also smoke and exhaustion. A kitchen servant in a large household might work near flames, yet also rise in the cold, carry heavy vessels, fetch supplies from chilly storage areas, and move between heat and draft until the body could hardly settle. Heat and comfort were not the same thing. Medieval people knew this difference intimately. In a castle or manor house, the cold morning was organized through hierarchy. Before the lord or lady appeared, servants were already moving. Fires had to be lit or revived in selected rooms. The hall might need preparation. Kitchens roared into activity. Water was carried. Floors were swept. Clothing was brushed or aired. Horses were seen to. The wealthy household appeared orderly because many people had already endured disorder on its behalf. This does not mean every servant lived in misery, or every lord lived in ease. Medieval households were complex communities with obligations running in multiple directions. A good lord was expected, at least in ideal terms, to provide food, protection, and order. Servants might gain training, shelter, and status within a great household. But the experience of cold remained uneven. Rank determined who could ask for warmth and who had to produce it. The architecture of status made this visible. A high-status chamber might have wall hangings that softened stone and reduced drafts. Tapestries were not simply decoration. They were insulation, signs of wealth, and expressions of taste. A bed might be raised from the floor, enclosed by curtains, layered with finer textiles. A brazier might add local warmth. Servants might bring warmed objects, dry clothes, or heated water when available. Each comfort was a little victory over the environment. Yet the victory was never complete. Great stone buildings had moods of their own. A chamber could be beautiful and still cold. A hall could be impressive and still difficult to heat. Long corridors, stairways, chapels, storerooms, and towers could hold the chill for hours. A noble person moving through a castle in winter might pass from a warm pocket near a fire into a passage that felt almost outdoor in its severity. Medieval luxury could soften cold, but it often did so unevenly, room by room, curtain by curtain, hearth by hearth. This unevenness shaped social life. People gathered near fires not only because fire was pleasant, but because warmth created a center. The hearth was a physical and social magnet. Stories, meals, work, negotiations, discipline, prayer, and gossip could gather around it. In a hall, the placement near the fire could reflect rank or usefulness. In a cottage, the hearth was the center of family survival. In a workshop, fire could be tool, hazard, and comfort all at once. Warmth had geography. Everyone understood where it was strongest and who had the right to occupy it. But there was always smoke. Modern imagination often separates warmth from smoke, because modern heating usually hides combustion somewhere else. In much of medieval life, heat arrived with visible consequences. Smoke blackened walls and beams. It clung to hair and garments. It irritated eyes. It flavored air, food, and fabric. In some homes, smoke was part of the preservation of thatch and timber. In others, it was simply endured. To be warm often meant breathing the proof of warmth. That trade-off becomes even clearer when we consider morning light. A house closed tightly against cold could feel dark and stale. Opening shutters brought light but also draft. Letting smoke escape could release heat. Keeping heat in could keep smoke low. A household was constantly adjusting these balances. There was no perfect setting. Medieval comfort came from compromise, and the compromises changed with weather, fuel, work, and the number of people inside. The body adapted to these compromises in ways both practical and cultural. People dressed in layers not just when going outside, but often indoors. Head coverings remained important inside spaces that modern people would consider domestic. Hands might be tucked into sleeves. Cloaks could be worn while sitting. Beds were used not only for sleeping, but sometimes as warm enclosed places for rest, illness, childbirth, or important domestic moments. The line between clothing and bedding was more flexible than ours, because both were part of the same struggle to hold heat around the body. Illness made cold more serious. A healthy adult might work through a cold morning, but the very young, the elderly, the sick, and the underfed were more vulnerable. Medieval medicine understood cold and heat through frameworks different from modern biology, often involving humoral ideas about balance, temperament, and the qualities of foods, environments, and bodies. But even without modern thermometers, people knew that exposure could weaken, pain could worsen in damp cold, and a poorly warmed sickroom could be dangerous. Care itself required warmth. A sick person might need a better place near the fire, extra bedding, warm liquids, or protection from drafts. But these comforts drew on household resources. If fuel was limited, caring for one person could change the comfort of everyone else. If bedding was scarce, giving extra coverings to the sick meant someone else had less. Medieval cold was therefore not only a physical condition, it could become a moral and emotional decision inside the household. The same was true around birth and infancy. Keeping a newborn warm mattered, and women's domestic knowledge around swaddling, bedding, hearth placement, and protection from drafts was part of household survival. Yet the room itself could still be smoky, crowded, and chilly. The medieval household did not offer perfect conditions for delicate bodies. It offered care within limits. Much of that care came through repetitive skill. Wrapping, warming, drying, feeding, watching, and adjusting to the weather hour by hour. In religious life, cold could carry another layer of meaning. Monastic communities often treated bodily discomfort as part of discipline, though the reality varied greatly by order, wealth, region, and period. Rising in the night for offices, walking through cold cloisters, chanting in unheated spaces, or sleeping in simpler conditions could be understood as part of spiritual formation. But even monasteries were not outside the practical world. They needed fuel, food, servants, lands, tenants, and buildings maintained against weather. The spiritual meaning of cold rested on material systems that still had to function. For ordinary laypeople, church could be another cold space. Stone churches, especially in winter, might feel damp and severe. Worship meant gathering with others, standing or kneeling, hearing familiar words, seeing candles, images, altars, and ritual, but not necessarily being warm. The church offered meaning, rhythm, obligation, and community. It did not always offer comfort of the body. A person who had woken cold at home could carry that cold into prayer, into market, into field, and back again. This continuity matters because medieval people did not divide life into comfortable private time and uncomfortable work time as sharply as many modern people do. Discomfort crossed boundaries. The home was not always restful. Work was not always separate from family. Animals were not always far from the living space. Religion was not only private belief but public rhythm. The cold morning flowed through all of these, linking them together. As the sun rose higher, the quality of cold changed. In some seasons, light brought real relief. Frost softened. A yard became easier to cross. Animals warmed. Smoke rose more clearly. Workers loosened their shoulders. In other seasons, especially during long damp winters, daylight only made the cold visible. Gray fields, wet thatch, bare trees, puddled lanes, and low clouds could make morning feel less like arrival and more like continuation of the night. Medieval people were attentive to seasonal signs because they had to be. The cold of early winter did not mean the same thing as the cold of late winter, when stored food might be lower and bodies more tired. A cold snap after planting could be a danger. A late frost could damage crops. A harsh winter could threaten animals and people alike. Waking cold was an individual sensation, but it belonged to the larger anxiety of the agricultural year. The household asked not only, "How cold is it this morning?" but also, "What will this cold do?" In a subsistence economy, weather could become memory. A brutal winter might be remembered for hunger, lost animals, failed work, or sickness. A mild winter could be relief. A wet season could ruin grain, rot hay, or make roads miserable. The cold morning was one small daily experience inside this larger uncertainty. Modern heating can make weather feel like something outside the window. For medieval people, weather came into the room and into the stomach. Food stores connected directly to cold. Winter could preserve some foods, but it also limited fresh supply. Salting, smoking, drying, fermenting, brewing, and storing were all ways to manage scarcity. A morning meal in a cold household might reflect months of preparation or the lack of it. Thick pottage, bread, ale, cheese, dried fish, preserved meat, onions, beans, peas, or whatever local diet allowed could warm or sustain the body. But food itself had to be earned from land, lordship, market, tithe, rent, labor, and luck. Here again, warmth and hunger met. A body that is underfed feels cold more sharply. A worker rising after a poor meal, or before eating properly, faced the morning with less internal fuel. Medieval cold was therefore not only about temperature. It was about calories, clothing, shelter, health, and workload. Those with better diets could resist cold better. Those with poorer diets carried the chill differently. The same air did not feel the same in every body. There were also laws and customs around access to resources that affected warmth. Rights to gather wood, graze animals, cut turf, collect fallen branches, or use common land varied widely and could be contested. What looks like a simple morning task, bringing home fuel, might depend on local agreements, obligations, restrictions, and conflicts. In some places, forests were tightly controlled. In others, customary rights gave villagers access to necessary materials. When those rights were pressured, ordinary warmth became political. This is a subtle but important point. A cold room might reflect not laziness or ignorance, but land use, lordship, legal rights, population pressure, and market change. The medieval household's fire was connected to the surrounding environment and to the power structures that governed it. To wake cold was, in a sense, to wake inside an economy. Towns created their own fuel pressures. Urban households needed heat for cooking and trade, but fuel had to be brought in from outside, purchased, stored, and distributed. Bakers, brewers, smiths, potters, and other trades could consume large amounts. The price of fuel affected the cost of living. Poor urban dwellers might struggle not because trees were absent from the world, but because the warmth of those trees had to pass through markets before reaching the hearth. Morning markets, when they opened, were themselves shaped by cold. Vendors arranged goods with stiff hands. Buyers moved quickly, hoods drawn close. Fish, meat, bread, vegetables, fuel, cloth, and tools appeared in the gray light. The cold could preserve some items while punishing the people who sold them. A woman selling produce, a boy carrying goods, a man leading animals, a servant sent to buy bread, all belonged to a morning economy that began before comfort. The town also had filth and freezing together. Waste in streets, animal dung, spilled liquids, butcher's refuse, rainwater, and mud could become more difficult in cold weather. Ice might harden what warmer days made foul. Thaw could release smells and mess again. The medieval street was a living surface, constantly altered by weather, traffic, animals, trades, and human habit. Waking cold in a town meant entering not a clean winter postcard, but a complicated, working environment. And yet people built patterns of sociability within this world. A cold morning could bring neighbors into contact at the well, the oven, the market, the mill, the church, or the lane. Shared discomfort did not erase conflict, but it could create recognition. People noticed who had fuel, who lacked it, whose animals were struggling, whose roof leaked, whose servant was late, whose bread was short, whose child looked ill. Medieval communities were often intensely observant because survival depended on proximity. The cold also shaped sound. Before a town or village fully awakened, one might hear doors opening, animals shifting, carts creaking, bells ringing, wood splitting, buckets knocking, voices low in the air, coughing near hearth smoke, footsteps on frozen ground, and the first sharper calls of work. Sound traveled differently in cold air. A quiet morning could make each task seem more distinct. The day assembled itself through small noises. Smell assembled with it. Wood smoke, damp straw, animals, stale bedding, wet wool, cooking grain, ale, manure, leather, ash, and cold earth made up the atmosphere of morning. Medieval life was not visually separate from smell as our images of it often are. To understand waking cold, we have to imagine not just the temperature, but the whole sensory field. The dull ache in fingers, the smoke in the throat, the weight of clothing, the dark corners of the room, the resistance of the door, the sound of the yard, the smell of the hearth returning to life. As the day gathered force, the first misery of waking might soften into routine. People did not spend every hour thinking about the cold. Habit is powerful. A person who had lived many winters learned the sequence of endurance. Rise quickly, dress fully, tend fire, move, eat when possible, keep hands busy, avoid unnecessary wet, stand near heat when allowed, sleep close when needed, repair what can be repaired. The cold was not always a crisis. Often it was the background against which competence was measured. But competence should not be mistaken for comfort. Medieval people could be skilled at enduring conditions that still wore them down. Their routines were intelligent, but intelligence did not remove hardship. A woman who knew exactly how to bank a fire still had to wake to embers that might fail. A man who knew how to dress for fieldwork still felt rain in his sleeves. A child who knew which part of the floor was warmest still rose into a room where warmth was scarce. Practical wisdom made life possible. It did not make it easy. By mid-morning, the household that had woken cold might be fully absorbed into labor. Beds were left behind. The hearth was active. Animals were fed or taken out. Water had been carried. Tools were in use. The first tasks had led to the next. Yet the memory of the cold room remained in the body, especially if the day offered no real dry warmth. In that sense, waking cold did not end when a person stood up. It traveled into the muscles, the pace of work, the hunger before food, and the longing for the evening fire. And the evening fire, which might seem like the answer to the morning, carried its own complications. Because as medieval people worked through the day, they were also preparing for the next night, the next dawn, and the next encounter with the same cold world. The morning did not stand alone. It was part of a cycle of fuel, clothing, food, labor, weather, and sleep that repeated so steadily that the most important question was not how people escaped it, but how they arranged an entire life around enduring it. How they arranged an entire life around enduring it depended on decisions that began long before the first cold morning of winter. Warmth was not something a medieval household simply discovered when the weather turned. It had to be prepared for, stored, negotiated, and folded into the daily rhythm of the year. A person waking cold in January was often feeling the consequences of work done, or not done, months earlier. Wood cut in the right season, peat dried properly, roofs repaired before the rains, clothing mended before frost, animals sheltered before their weakness became visible. In that sense, the medieval winter morning was never only a morning. It was the arrival of autumn labor, summer harvest, spring repair, and older customs all at once. A cold room revealed whether the thatch had held. It revealed whether the household had enough bedding. It revealed whether the store of fuel had been stretched too thin. It revealed whether the family had extra hands, good tools, access to common resources, and enough food to keep bodies warm from the inside. The chill that touched the face at dawn was the surface of a much deeper structure. For many rural households, one of the most important parts of preparing for cold was managing fuel. Wood had to be seasoned because wet wood smoked badly and burned poorly. Brushwood and kindling had to be gathered. Peat, where used, had to be cut and dried. In woodland regions, coppicing created cycles of regrowth that supplied poles, sticks, and fuel over time. In places where wood was scarce, people relied more heavily on alternatives. Peat, turf, dried dung in some areas, straw, or purchased fuel. None of these was simply there. Each required time, rights, and physical effort. The cold morning, therefore, began months earlier with someone's back bent in a woodlet, someone's hands stacking branches, someone watching the sky and hoping stored fuel would dry before damp weather returned. It began with local rules about who could take what from which land. It began with disputes over access, with manorial rights, village customs, forest laws, and quiet understandings between neighbors. A hearth fire looked domestic, but it was tied to the landscape. This is one of the reasons medieval cold can feel so different from modern cold. Today, in many homes, warmth arrives through hidden networks. Pipes, wires, fuel lines, meters, boilers, grids, markets, and distant extraction. In the medieval world, those networks were shorter and more visible. Warmth could be seen in a stack of wood by the wall, in a bundle of sticks near the door, in a peat pile, in the ash under the hearth, in the servant carrying logs through a corridor, in the child sent to gather fallen twigs, in the cart that brought fuel to town. Heat had a shape before it became flame. It also had a smell. Dry wood, damp wood, peat smoke, charcoal, straw smoke, and kitchen ash all created different atmospheres. A household might know not only how much fuel remained, but what kind of fire it would make. Some fuel burned hot and fast. Some smoldered. Some filled the room with smoke. Some was better for cooking, some for heating, some for trades. A baker, smith, potter, brewer, or household cook did not simply need fire. They needed the right kind of fire for the work. And because fuel was valuable, people used space carefully. Smaller rooms were easier to warm. Bed curtains trapped heat. Wall hangings softened cold walls. Benches and sleeping places were positioned with attention to drafts. In poorer dwellings, there might be fewer choices, but people still learned the small geography of warmth. They knew which side of the room caught the worst wind. They knew where damp gathered. They knew how close to sit without being bothered by smoke, sparks, or crowding. They knew whether opening a door would ruin what little warmth had been built. A medieval household, then, was not merely a shelter. It was a system for managing losses. Heat escaped through roofs, shutters, doors, floors, chimneys, walls, and human movement. Every trip outside carried warmth away. Every open door invited air in. Every wet cloak brought cold with it. Every cooking task demanded fuel. Every sick child or elderly relative required extra care. The home was constantly trying to hold together a fragile interior climate, and often it only partially succeeded. The roof mattered greatly. Thatch, timber, tiles, and stone roofing all had different qualities and costs. A well-maintained thatch could provide insulation, but it required upkeep and carried risks of fire. Tiles were more durable but expensive and not universal. Leaks could change everything. A small drip in warm weather might be annoying. In winter, it could mean damp bedding, damp straw, rotten materials, and a cold that seemed to rise from inside the house itself. Medieval damp was not a small inconvenience. It was one of cold's closest allies. Walls, too, varied widely. Wattle and daub, timber framing, stone, cob, turf, brick in some later and urban settings. Each created different relationships with weather. Stone could be strong and prestigious, but it could hold cold deeply. Timber and daub could be warmer in some conditions, but vulnerable to decay and repair needs. Earthen materials could insulate but also suffer from damp. The idea that one type of medieval building was simply better or worse misses the real pattern. Every material solved one problem while creating another. Inside, clothing extended architecture around the body. A woolen tunic was a wall that moved. A cloak was a portable roof. A hood created a small chamber around the head and neck. Mittens, hose, wraps, caps, and layered linen helped build an individual shelter when the room itself failed. People did not necessarily expect indoor clothing to be light. In many settings, indoor and outdoor warmth overlapped. One could remain cloaked at home, sit by the hearth in layers, or sleep partly dressed when necessary. This constant layering shaped posture and movement. Heavy garments changed how a person worked. Wet hems dragged against the body. Belts gathered fabric away from tasks. Sleeves might be rolled, tucked, or tied. Hoods could limit hearing or vision. Shoes stiffened in cold or softened in wet. The body was never separate from its materials. A medieval person's mourning was partly the act of assembling wool, linen, leather, and habit into a workable defense against the day. But clothing also had to be maintained. Wool needed cleaning, airing, brushing, mending. Linen had to be washed, though washing in cold weather brought its own misery. Shoes needed repair. Cloaks wore thin at edges. Hose tore. A small hole could matter if wind found it. A missing hood, a worn blanket, or cracked footwear could turn ordinary cold into something harder. The difference between manageable discomfort and serious suffering could be a few layers of cloth. Women's work was often central to that survival. Spinning, sewing, mending, washing, drying, airing, patching, and managing household textiles were not secondary domestic details. They were part of the household's defense against cold. A blanket did not remain useful by accident. A child's clothing did not repair itself. Linen did not clean itself. Wool did not appear without sheep, shearing, processing, spinning, weaving, buying, trading, or inheritance. Every warm layer carried hidden labor. Textiles were valuable enough to be counted, saved, passed down, and guarded. Beds, blankets, sheets, hangings, garments, and cloth could represent wealth in a form that touched the skin. In wills and inventories, textiles often appear because they mattered. To us, a blanket may seem ordinary. In medieval life, the quality and quantity of bedding could mark a household status and determine how the night felt. Warmth could be inherited. At the same time, not all warmth was private. Many medieval communities had shared or semi-shared sources of heat and production. The bakehouse or communal oven, the forge, the brewhouse, the mill, the manor kitchen, the monastery kitchen, the public bathhouse in some towns and periods, the crowded church on a feast day. These were places where bodies, labor, and heat gathered. A person might feel warmth most strongly not in their own sleeping place, but in a space of work, obligation, or community. The communal oven is a useful example because it shows how comfort and control could mix. Bread was central to diet in many regions, and baking required serious heat. In some villages or towns, households used ovens controlled by a lord, monastery, town authority, or neighborhood arrangement. The oven created warmth, smell, and sociability, but also fees, rules, waiting, and dependency. The heat that baked bread was not simply domestic freedom. It could be part of a larger system of rights and obligations. Similarly, the mill saved labor but often cost a fee. The forge supplied tools but depended on specialized skill and fuel. The manor kitchen fed many but required servants to rise early and work hard near smoke and flame. Medieval warmth often appeared where power and labor met. Heat was rarely neutral. It drew people together, but it also revealed who controlled resources. Winter clothing in towns could become a visible language of rank. A wealthy merchant in fur-lined garments experienced the street differently from a porter in worn wool. Fur, especially, offered both warmth and status. Certain types of fur and fabric signaled wealth, office, or aspiration. Sumptuary expectations and social judgments could shape what people wore, though enforcement and practice varied. The body on a cold morning was not only protected, it was displayed. For the very poor, the lack of adequate clothing could be brutally limiting. Beggars, vagrants, the displaced, widows without strong support, or laborers facing hard times might experience winter as danger rather than discomfort. Medieval charity often responded to cold through clothing, alms, shelter, or food, especially around religious institutions and feast days. Giving garments to the poor was not symbolic only. It met a physical need that could become urgent with the weather. This charitable world reminds us that medieval society knew cold could kill, weaken, and humiliate. Sermons, saints' lives, charitable bequests, hospital foundations, and local practices all suggest awareness of bodily vulnerability. To clothe the naked and shelter the poor were not abstract virtues. They answered conditions visible in the street, at the church door, on roads, and near markets. The cold morning made inequality visible in breath, skin, fabric, and posture. Roads were another cold reality. For anyone traveling, waking cold could happen in inns, barns, monasteries, roadside shelters, or under poor cover. Pilgrims, merchants, messengers, soldiers, seasonal laborers, and the displaced all had to manage cold away from home. A traveler lacked the small knowledge that made a familiar house survivable, which corner was least drafty, where dry wood was kept, how to coax the household fire, which neighbor might help. Travel exposed people to strange beds, shared rooms, uncertain fires, damp cloaks, and roads that could punish the body for miles. An inn could offer warmth, food, company, and danger in varying proportions. Sleeping spaces might be shared. Bedding could be questionable. Fires might be crowded. Animals, goods, strangers, and noise filled the scene. A traveler who had paid for shelter still might wake cold because the fire had faded, the room was crowded, or the bedding was thin. Hospitality mattered because exposure was real, but hospitality did not guarantee comfort in the modern hotel sense. Monasteries and religious houses often played a role in sheltering travelers, the poor, or the sick, though practices varied widely. Their guest houses, infirmaries, kitchens, and halls were part of a broader landscape of refuge. Yet even refuge was shaped by weather and resources. A monastery could be warmer than a ditch, but a stone guest hall in winter could still chill the bones. Medieval care existed within medieval limits. Soldiers and armies faced cold in another way. Campaigns were often shaped by season because weather affected roads, supplies, horses, morale, disease, and the ability to live off the land. A soldier waking cold might do so in a tent, barn, field, siege camp, or town lodging. Armor, when present, could be cold to handle. Metal, leather, damp cloth, mud, and fatigue created a harsh mixture. War added danger, but the cold itself remained a persistent enemy, quiet and patient. For peasants living near conflict, winter cold could be worsened by disruption. If armies took food, burned buildings, seized animals, or damaged stores, the household's ability to endure cold collapsed. A lost cow, a burned herrick, a stolen blanket, a broken door, or a ruined roof could change the entire season. Cold was manageable when systems held. It became devastating when violence, disease, poor harvest, or economic pressure broke those systems. Famine years made this especially severe. When food was scarce, people had fewer calories to resist cold. When animals died or had to be slaughtered, future labor and food supplies weakened. When prices rose, fuel and clothing could become harder to obtain. A winter morning during hardship was not just colder because of weather. It was colder because the household had less power to answer it. The same frost could fall on every roof, but it did not fall on equal conditions. Medieval Europe also went through climatic variation. The period was not environmentally static. The later medieval centuries, especially as conditions shifted toward cooler and more unstable patterns in parts of Europe, brought episodes of difficult weather that could affect harvests and daily life. But we have to be careful here. People did not experience climate as a neat historical label. They experienced a wet summer, a failed crop, a hard frost, a river flooding, a muddy road, a long winter, a late spring. Climate entered history as local trouble. This is why an ordinary morning can be such a powerful doorway into the past. It avoids the mistake of seeing medieval life only through kings, battles, and dates. A cold room at dawn tells us about forest rights, textile labor, roof repair, animal care, household rank, diet, architecture, gendered work, childhood, illness, charity, trade, and climate. The small discomfort opens into the whole society. And still, medieval people did not live only in suffering. They sought pleasure and beauty within these limits. A good fire was appreciated. A warm meal mattered. A dry cloak could feel like luxury. A sunny wall in late morning could draw people toward it. A crowded room might be annoying but also lively. Feast days, songs, stories, shared food, ale, church rituals, market encounters, and family closeness could all exist in the same world as cold floors and smoky hearths. The past was not one emotion. This balance is important because it keeps us from turning medieval people into either victims or quaint figures in a picturesque scene. They were neither simply miserable nor comfortably rustic. They were practical, social, believing, desiring, tired, skilled, anxious, humorous, and adaptive. They built meaning around hardship without making hardship disappear. They normalized what they could not easily change, and they valued relief when they found it. A fire on a winter evening could therefore carry a depth of feeling modern viewers may underestimate. It was light, heat, cooking, safety, companionship, and symbol all at once. People gathered around it not because they lacked imagination, but because the hearth was where the household became most visibly alive. Sparks, smoke, voices, food, tools, animals at the edge, children near the warmth, elders seated closer, workers drying sleeves. All of this formed a scene repeated across centuries in countless variations. But the fire also had to be watched. Sparks could threaten thatch. Children could be burned. Smoke could overwhelm. Fuel could run low. Ash had to be managed. Pots had to be moved. The hearth was comfort, but never passive comfort. It demanded attention. A modern heating system disappears when it works well. A medieval fire announced itself constantly, and the household's relationship with it was almost intimate. Night preparation began before night. A family or household might consider how much fuel to burn before sleeping, how to bank embers, where to place damp garments, whether animals were secure, whether doors were latched, whether bedding was dry, whether children were covered, whether someone sick needed to be nearer the fire. The next morning's cold was being shaped by these choices. People did not merely go to bed. They arranged conditions for surviving the hours ahead. In wealthier households, this preparation could involve servants warming beds, closing shutters, drawing curtains, bringing candles, placing coverings, and ensuring fires were set for the morning. In poorer homes, the same needs existed but with fewer resources and fewer hands. Someone still had to think ahead. Someone still had to decide whether to use more fuel now or save it for cooking tomorrow. Someone still had to judge whether a blanket could be spared, whether a wet garment would dry, whether the roof would drip, whether the embers would last. This nightly calculation may be one of the most intimate forms of historical difference. Modern comfort often allows people to forget the mechanics of survival. Medieval comfort required memory. It required knowing the weather, the house, the woodpile, the bodies in the room, the animals outside, the tasks tomorrow, the limits of food, and the habits of fire. To be competent in such a world meant anticipating discomfort before it arrived. And when morning came again, the cycle repeated with slight changes. Perhaps the wind had shifted. Perhaps the embers survived better than expected. Perhaps a child was ill. Perhaps a servant overslept. Perhaps frost sealed the yard. Perhaps rain turned the path to mud. Perhaps the stored wood was wetter than hoped. Perhaps the first person awake found that the cold was ordinary, manageable, almost unremarkable. Or perhaps they knew, before anyone else stirred, that this day would be harder. There is a quiet power in that first person awake. Across medieval Europe, in homes grand and poor, someone entered the cold before others did. Someone crossed the room, touched the ashes, opened the door, stepped into the yard, lifted the bucket, checked the animals, or called the household into motion. The day's warmth, food, and order often began with that person's discomfort. History rarely names them, yet the morning depended on them. In a peasant home, it may have been a woman stirring the hearth, a man going to the animals, a child sent for water, an elderly person waking early from pain or habit, or everyone rising nearly together because space and work left little privacy. In a manner, it may have been servants in the kitchen before the family appeared. In a monastery, it may have been the bell calling bodies from sleep to prayer. In a town, it may have been apprentices opening shutters and preparing the shop. The forms changed, but the pattern remained. Cold first, work next, warmth only after effort. And as medieval Europe moved from the private hour of waking into the wider day, the meaning of cold kept changing. It was no longer only a sensation to endure. It became a measure of social order, of preparedness, of resourcefulness, of dependence, of rank, and of the invisible labor that kept households alive. The cold morning asked questions of everyone: who had fuel, who had clothing, who had shelter, who had help, who had rights, who had authority, who had to rise first, and who was allowed to remain warm a little longer. Those questions followed people beyond the home and into the working landscape. They followed the plowman to the field, the servant to the kitchen, the monk to the choir, the merchant to the road, the widow to the church door, the child to the well, the craftsman to the shop, and the shepherd toward the animals waiting in the gray light. By the time the sun had fully risen, the cold had already done more than chill the air. It had arranged the morning's duties, exposed the household's strengths and weaknesses, and pushed each person toward the particular work by which they would try to earn, protect, or borrow the next small measure of warmth. That next small measure of warmth might be found in motion, in a mouthful of hot food, in a corner near the hearth, in the shelter of a barn, or in the temporary relief of sunlight falling across a wall. But it was rarely permanent. Medieval warmth tended to arrive in fragments. Person moved toward it, used it, lost it, and then moved again. The day was a chain of brief protections against a cold that returned whenever labor paused. Clothing dampened, doors opened, or the sky darkened. For a field worker, the early hours could be the hardest because the body had not yet generated the heat of labor. A person walking toward the fields might feel the cold most sharply in the hands and face, where clothing protected less. Tools carried over the shoulder or in the hand could feel hard and cold before use. Wooden handles were kinder than iron, but even wood held the morning air. Metal edges, hooks, buckles, knives, and fittings could bite the skin. The body learned to grip, adjust, tuck hands away when possible, and keep moving. The field itself was a different kind of room, broad and exposed. In the home, cold was trapped and negotiated. In the open, it had space. Wind moved across plowed earth, stubble, pasture, and winter grass with little interruption. A hedge, a low wall, a stand of trees, or the side of a barn could matter enormously. The landscape offered shelters, but they were scattered and imperfect. The worker became aware of slope, shade, mud, drainage, and direction of wind in a deeply practical way. This is why medieval knowledge of land was not abstract. People knew where frost lingered, where paths became dangerous, where animals should not be driven in wet weather, where water collected, where the wind came hardest, and where a person could pause without losing too much heat. Such knowledge was rarely written down by the people who used it most. It lived in habit, in repeated instruction, in the bodies of those who crossed the same ground year after year. A cold morning was also a lesson in local geography. The tools of winter work often made cold visible. A wooden rake, a flail for threshing, a billhook, a spade, a mattock, a pruning tool, a cart, a yoke, a rope, a harness, a basket, each carried the weather into the hand. If a rope was wet, it stiffened. If leather froze or dried badly, it cracked. If iron was neglected, it suffered. Tools had to be maintained not as a matter of neatness, but because poor tools wasted strength, and strength was already being spent by the cold. Threshing in winter could be one of those tasks that warmed the body through repetition. Grain laid out on a barn floor, flails rising and falling, dust in the air, breath visible in the half-light. This was indoor work only in a limited sense. A barn could shelter from rain and wind, but it was not necessarily warm. The movement created heat, but the pause between movements could bring chill back quickly. The barn had its own atmosphere. Straw, grain dust, animals nearby, cold timber, and the dull rhythm of labor. For those working with animals, cold shaped both patience and risk. A horse or ox might be less willing to move in harsh weather. Hooves, mud, frozen ground, and poor footing could cause injury. A household that depended on draft animals had to preserve them carefully. Feeding animals through winter required stored fodder, and stored fodder depended on previous weather and labor. The cold morning in the stable was therefore linked to the hay meadow months before, to the scythe, the drying, the carrying, the stacking, and the hope that rain had not spoiled too much. A shepherd or herdsman faced an even wider exposure. Watching animals in cold weather meant reading the land and the flock together. Sheep could endure much, but lambing season, wet cold, disease, and poor grazing could threaten them. The human watcher carried their own cold while measuring the animal's needs. A body wrapped in wool guarded other bodies that produced wool. That circular dependence, humans warming themselves with the products of animals they had to protect from cold, was one of the quiet foundations of medieval rural life. Wool itself deserves attention because it was one of the great answers to the European cold. Not a perfect answer and not equally available in every quality to everyone, but a powerful one. Sheep turned grass into fiber. Human labor turned fiber into warmth. Shearing, sorting, washing, carding, combing, spinning, weaving, fulling, dyeing, cutting, sewing, mending. Each step carried work. A cloak on a winter morning was not just a garment. It was a long chain of rural and urban labor resting on the shoulders. In places where wool production became commercially important, especially in parts of England, Flanders, Italy, and other regions at different times, the story of warmth connected to markets far beyond the household. Cloth could be local, regional, or international. Fine woolens could travel great distances. The same material that kept one peasant warm might also become the basis of merchant wealth, urban industry, and political tension. A cold morning and a trade network were not as separate as they appear. For ordinary people, however, the immediate question was simpler. Was the garment thick enough, dry enough, and still usable? A worn cloak might be patched rather than replaced. Children might inherit garments. Cloth could be turned, remade, cut down, layered, or repurposed. A blanket might become clothing. Old clothing might become bedding. Scraps might become wrappings. Nothing warm was wasted casually. Cold gave value to every piece of fabric. The management of wet clothing was a daily problem. A cloak that protected against wind could become heavy with rain. Footwear soaked in mud might not dry fully before morning. Linen washed in cold weather could take a long time to dry. A worker returning home damp in the evening might hang garments near the hearth. But space near the fire was limited and crowded. Too close and cloth could scorch. Too far and it remained damp. In a smoky room, drying clothes absorbed the smell of fire. Yet damp clothing worn again in the morning could draw heat from the body. This meant the hearth served as a drying machine as much as a heater and cooker. Around it gathered shoes, stockings, cloaks, swaddling cloths, sacks, tools, herbs, food, and sometimes tempers. The space near the fire was valuable. Who could place what there and for how long mattered inside the household. A servant's wet garment might have less claim than a child's blanket or a master's cloak. Even drying space could reveal hierarchy. Inside urban workshops, the day's warmth was just as uneven. A tailor might sit for long hours in cold light, fingers busy with cloth but body still. A scribe in a chilly room might struggle with stiff fingers, thick ink, and the discipline of neat work. A merchant counting goods near a doorway might alternate between mental labor and bodily discomfort. A shoemaker handled leather that responded to damp and cold. A mason or carpenter worked with materials that were themselves weather-sensitive. The cold entered craft not only through the worker's body, but through the material's behavior. Some crafts required water in ways that made cold especially hard. Fullers cleaning and thickening cloth, dyers handling vats, tanners working hides, brewers managing liquids, fishmongers handling wet goods, and washerwomen laboring over textiles all faced cold through moisture. Wet hands in a cold season could become painful, cracked, and clumsy. Work that seems ordinary in an account book could feel punishing in the fingers. Kitchens, by contrast, appear at first to be warm places. And they were, in bursts, the great kitchen of a lordly household, monastery, inn, or urban establishment could be filled with fire, steam, boiling pots, roasting meat, smoke, shouted instruction, and intense movement. But a kitchen worker's relationship with warmth was not restful. Heat came with danger, sweat, lifting, burns, smoke, sharp tools, slippery floors, and sudden transitions to cold storerooms, yards, wells, or cellars. A person might sweat near the fire, then step into cold air with damp clothing, and feel chilled more deeply afterward. Cellars and storage spaces held another kind of cold. They were useful precisely because they were cool, stable, and protected. Food, ale, wine, preserved goods, and supplies needed such places. But someone had to enter them. Stone steps, damp walls, low light, and heavy containers made the cold of storage part of the day's work. The household benefited from cool preservation, while the servant or worker carried the bodily cost of accessing it. Food preparation in the cold also reveals how much warmth came through the stomach. Hot pottage was not glamorous, but it could be profoundly important. A pot kept near the fire, thick with grains, peas, beans, vegetables, herbs, or bits of meat when available, offered heat and energy together. Bread gave substance. Ale or small beer gave calories and familiarity. In some places, cheese, onions, dried fish, or preserved foods supported the morning. The exact diet varied widely, but the principle remained. A warm meal could change the day's beginning. Yet hot food required fuel, vessels, water, time, and someone's labor. Breakfast, where it existed as a meaningful morning meal, was not always the structured event modern people imagine. Many people ate according to work, season, status, and local habit. Some might begin with bread and ale, some with leftovers, some with pottage, some with little until later. The wealthy could arrange meals more easily. The poor might have to begin work before the body was fully fed. Hunger made the cold sharper. Fasting and religious calendars could also shape eating. Medieval Christianity structured time through feast days, fast days, Lent, Advent in some observances, vigils, and local practices. Not everyone followed every rule equally, and customs varied, but the rhythm mattered. A cold morning during a fasting period had a different bodily meaning. Food was never just fuel. It was moral, communal, seasonal, and economic. Still, whatever its meaning, the body felt the absence of warmth when the stomach was empty. The relation between cold and time becomes clearer when we think about clocks, or the relative lack of them for much of the period. People lived by bells, daylight, task, season, and obligation. Mechanical clocks spread gradually in later medieval Europe, especially in towns, monasteries, and public settings, but the ordinary person's morning was often governed less by exact minutes than by necessity. Cold did not wait for a precise hour. It began when the fire faded, when the body woke, when animals needed care, when the bell rang, when the master called, when dawn appeared, or when work could no longer be postponed. Winter shortened daylight and compressed labor. Tasks that needed light had to be arranged carefully. A cold, dark morning might delay some outdoor work but intensify indoor work. Candlelight and lamplight cost resources. Rushlights, tallow candles, wax candles for the wealthier or religious uses, oil lamps in some places, these all gave light at a price. To stay awake in warmth and light was not free. Darkness itself could become a form of cold because it limited movement, work, and safety. This made the winter day feel different from the summer day, not just in temperature, but in shape. Summer could exhaust through long hours, heat, flies, field labor, and urgency. Winter exhausted through cold, darkness, damp, hunger, and the constant guarding of resources. Medieval people did not simply suffer one season and rest in another. Each season demanded the body in its own language. For children, the seasonal rhythm trained expectation. A child might learn that winter meant staying close to the fire when allowed, keeping shoes dry if possible, sharing bedding, fetching kindling, caring for smaller siblings, or helping with animals. Play did not vanish, but it adapted. Snow, frost, and ice could bring moments of excitement as well as danger. A frozen pond might attract attention. A slippery yard might cause injury. Childhood included curiosity, but also chores and exposure. Elderly people experienced cold differently. Stiff joints, weaker circulation, illness, and dependence on others could make winter harder. An older person seated near the fire might occupy a place of both vulnerability and authority. They might tell stories, watch children, mend, advise, pray, or simply endure. Their proximity to the hearth could reflect care, respect, or need. In a crowded home, keeping the old warm was both an act of affection and a practical challenge. The sick room, if there was a separate one, or the sick corner, if there was not, sharpened the meaning of warmth. Fever, chills, coughs, pain, childbirth, wounds, and infections all demanded attention. Medieval remedies often used warming foods, herbs, poultices, baths, bedding, and regulated environments according to the medical understanding of the time. Some treatments were helpful in ordinary ways. Others reflected theories we no longer share. But behind the medical language was the practical knowledge that bodies in distress needed care against cold, damp, and exhaustion. Bathing and washing complicate the picture further. It is a mistake to imagine medieval Europeans as never washing, but it is also a mistake to imagine washing as easy. Public bathhouses existed in many medieval towns at certain times and places, though their availability, reputation, and regulation changed. Domestic washing occurred in many forms. Hands, faces, feet, linens, utensils, and bodies could be cleaned according to means and circumstance. But warm water required fuel. Washing in cold water during winter could be unpleasant. Drying afterward required space and heat. Cleanliness, like warmth, depended on resources. For the poor, washing could become another negotiation. Clothes needed cleaning, but washing could make them wet for too long. Bodies needed care, but warm water cost fuel. Bedding needed airing, but damp weather made airing difficult. The household had to choose when and how to clean without making the cold worse. This is one reason smoke, sweat, animal smells, damp wool, and cooking odors formed the normal atmosphere of life. The sensory world was not a failure of effort alone. It was the result of limits. Among the wealthy, washing could be more elaborate. Warm water might be brought by servants. Linen could be changed more often. Perfumed herbs, basins, towels, and private chambers offered refinement. Yet again, comfort rested on hidden labor. Water had to be heated and carried. Towels had to be washed and dried. Chambers had to be warmed. The luxury of cleanliness was built on someone else's contact with cold water, hot vessels, and tiring movement. This pattern repeats throughout medieval life. The comfort of one person often required the discomfort of another. A warmed bed meant someone prepared it. A heated bath meant someone carried water. A bright hall meant someone tended lamps or candles. A dry cloak meant someone brushed and hung it. A meal in a warm room meant someone worked in a kitchen before dawn. Cold did not disappear in wealthy spaces. It was redistributed. But even redistribution had limits. During severe weather, large households could still strain. More mouths meant more food, more fuel, more bedding, more animal care, more management. Wealth helped, but winter could test even well-organized estates. Roads might become difficult, supplies delayed, animals weakened, tenants unable to pay, servants overworked. The Lord's hearth was connected to the estate's fields and villages. If those suffered, the warmth of the manor was not untouched. For monasteries, winter management could be especially complex. Monastic houses were not only religious communities. Many were landholders, employers, providers of charity, centers of storage, education, hospitality, and production. Their cold mornings involved monks, lay brothers, servants, tenants, guests, the poor, the sick, animals, kitchens, bakeries, breweries, infirmaries, scriptoria, and churches. The bell that called monks to prayer also sounded within a material world that had to be heated, fed, and repaired. A scriptorium in winter is often imagined romantically. Quiet monks copying manuscripts by pale light. The reality could be far more bodily. Writing with cold fingers is difficult. Ink thickens. Parchment responds to humidity. Light is limited. Concentration competes with discomfort. Some monastic rules and practices allowed certain accommodations. Others prized austerity. But even the making of beautiful books could happen under conditions where warmth was partial and discipline was physical. This matters because medieval culture itself was produced in the cold. Charters, accounts, prayers, manuscripts, sermons, letters, and records were not created by floating minds. They were made by bodies in rooms with fingers, eyes, breath, tools, light, and temperature. The documents historians use to reconstruct the past may themselves have passed through cold mornings before ink dried on the page. Cold also shaped memory through festivals and relief. The winter calendar contained moments of gathering. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, local feasts, saints' days, household celebrations, communal meals were possible. These did not erase hardship, but they gave structure to dark months. A feast in winter was powerful partly because cold and scarcity made warmth, food, candles, music, and company feel more intense. Celebration drew meaning from contrast. In many villages and towns, the cold season could bring more indoor sociability. Spinning, mending, tool repair, storytelling, drinking, planning, bargaining, and domestic work around the hearth. Long evenings were not empty. They were filled with tasks suited to darkness and weather. Women spinning by firelight, men repairing equipment, children listening, elders recalling old winters, servants moving in and out with work. These scenes remind us that endurance was social. People did not simply wait for spring. They inhabited winter with routines of their own. But winter sociability could also sharpen conflict. Crowded rooms, limited food, smoke, tired bodies, and long darkness could strain tempers. Privacy was scarce. A household might contain family members, servants, apprentices, lodgers, or animals within close quarters. Everyone knew who used too much fuel, who failed to rise, who complained, who received the best place near the fire, who tracked mud inside, who let the embers die. Cold created dependence, and dependence could create friction. The law might enter these domestic and local tensions in unexpected ways. Disputes over fuel rights, theft of wood, damage to hedges, trespass in forests, failure to maintain buildings, unpaid rents, or obligations of service could all affect the ability to stay warm. A stolen bundle of wood was not trivial if fuel was scarce. Cutting branches without permission could be treated seriously because wood represented value, authority, and survival. The cold morning could lead, indirectly, to the manor court or town authority. In forested regions under strong lordly or royal control, the rules around woodland use could be especially sensitive. Forest did not simply mean a place full of trees. In medieval legal contexts, it could mean a jurisdiction of rights, restrictions, and privileges. People living near such spaces might see abundant wood and still be limited in what they could take. The difference between seeing fuel and having the right to use fuel could be the difference between comfort and hardship. This is another expectation reversal. We may imagine medieval people surrounded by nature and therefore free to use it. But nature was often owned, governed, taxed, protected, or contested. Land was not an open warehouse of survival. Woods, pastures, streams, mills, ovens, and fields were embedded in social power. The cold body at dawn was tied to rules that might have been made far from the hearth. Even common rights, where they existed, required maintenance and community memory. Who could gather deadwood? Who could graze animals? Who could cut turf? At what season? In what amount? These were not always simple questions. Custom could protect ordinary people, but custom could also be challenged. Population growth, commercialization, enclosure pressures in some contexts, lordly demands, and local conflict all affected access. Warmth was a legal and communal matter as well as a physical one. As afternoon approached, the morning's cold might seem distant to someone warmed by labor. But the body could begin to tire, and tiredness changed the cold again. A worker who sweated under layers might become chilled when activity slowed. A damp shirt beneath wool could turn against the skin. Hands that had worked all morning might ache when still. The sun, if weak, might slide behind clouds or buildings. The day that began with the search for warmth gradually turned toward the fear of losing it again. This turning point is important because medieval time often carried a practical anxiety modern people feel less sharply. Evening was not simply the end of work. It was the closing of light, the return of cold, the need to secure animals, bring in tools, prepare food, manage fires, and reassemble the household against night. The day curved back toward the same problem with which it began. To fail in the evening was to suffer in the morning. A worker returning from the field might bring mud on shoes, damp on clothing, hunger in the body, and a desire for the fire that others were also seeking. A town apprentice might close shutters, bring goods inside, sweep the threshold, and retreat into a workshop or upper room that was no warmer than it had to be. A kitchen servant might face the busiest heat of the day just as others prepared to rest. A shepherd might count animals before darkness. A child might carry one more bundle of sticks. The whole community began turning inward. And in that inward movement, the hearth became central again, not as a decorative symbol, but as the fragile engine of the night ahead. Pots were set, embers were stirred, fuel was judged, damp garments were arranged. Stories might begin, arguments might soften or sharpen. The room filled with smoke, steam, hunger, relief, and the tired knowledge that tomorrow's cold was already forming in the corners. Before sleep could come, the household had to decide how much of its precious warmth could be spent, and how much had to be saved for the first person who would wake before dawn and reach once more into the ashes. And reach once more into the ashes, not with surprise, but with the practiced caution of someone who already knew that the day's first comfort depended on what had survived the night. In that small gesture, a hand searching for hidden heat beneath gray ash, we can see much of medieval life condensed into a single moment. It was not dramatic in the way chronicles preferred. No battle turned on it. No king was crowned because of it. But for the people who lived through these mornings, the survival of an ember could change the beginning of a day. If the ember was still alive, the household had a chance to begin gently, or at least less harshly. A little dry kindling might catch. A faint glow might become flame. Smoke might rise, then clear a little. The room might begin to change, not all at once, but in layers. First the hearth, then the hands nearest to it, then the pot, then the air close by, then perhaps the mood of those waking around it. Warmth did not flood the room. It negotiated its way into it. If the ember had died, the morning became harder. Fire had to be remade. Tools might be needed. A neighbor might be asked. More time would pass in cold air. More patience would be spent before food, light, and warmth returned. It is difficult for us, surrounded by switches, thermostats, pilot lights, and invisible systems, to feel the meaning of that uncertainty. But in medieval Europe, fire was not simply a convenience. It was a relationship between skill, material, time, and luck. That relationship shaped the whole day. The fire cooked the pottage, dried the sleeves, warmed the sick, softened the dark, drew the family together, and reminded everyone of their dependence on wood, peat, straw, labor, and the wider world beyond the house. A hearth seemed domestic, but it was connected to forest rights, animal care, women's textile work, children's chores, servants' duties, market prices, roof repair, and the weather of seasons already gone. To wake cold was to wake inside that web. This is what makes the medieval morning so revealing. It was not only uncomfortable because people lacked modern heating. It was uncomfortable because comfort itself had not yet become constant, private, quiet, and expected. Warmth was still visible. It had to be made by hands. It had to be carried on backs. It had to be stored in wood piles, blankets, animal bodies, woolen garments, curtained beds, and pots kept near the fire. It could be lost by an open door, a wet cloak, a failed roof, a dying ember, a poor harvest, a sick animal, a disputed right, or a long winter. And yet medieval people did not move through this world in a state of endless astonishment at its hardship. They knew it. They learned it early. They built routines around it. They knew how to bank a fire, how to layer clothing, how to crowd a bed, how to keep the wind from one corner, how to dry a shoe without burning it, how to stretch fuel, how to judge a sky, how to read frost, how to listen for animals before sunrise. Their knowledge was practical, inherited, local, and often invisible to written history. We should not mistake that knowledge for comfort. A person may be skilled at enduring cold and still suffer from it. A household may have good habits and still wake to damp straw, smoky air, stiff fingers, and aching feet. The medieval poor were not foolish for living in cold rooms. They were living inside limits set by materials, land, money, labor, hierarchy, and climate. The medieval wealthy were not modern people in older clothing. They too inhabited a world where heat was local, uneven, and dependent on servants, walls, fuel, and fire. The difference was distribution. Some woke to revive the fire. Others woke after it had been revived for them. Some carried water. Others washed in it after it had been warmed. Some cut and hauled fuel. Others sat beside the flame. Some slept under worn blankets with siblings and insects. Others slept behind curtains in raised beds with finer coverings. Cold touched everyone, but not equally. It revealed rank not in grand ceremonies, but in small privileges. Who rose first, who stayed covered longer, who stood nearest the hearth, who had dry wool, who had a servant to prepare the chamber, who could afford to burn more fuel without fear of tomorrow. That unevenness did not make medieval society simple. There were obligations, customs, charities, shared spaces, and forms of mutual dependence. Villagers helped one another, argued with one another, watched one another. Religious houses offered shelter and food in some circumstances. Lords were expected, at least in principle, to maintain order and protection. Families cared for their own as best they could. But beneath every moral language of duty and community lay the same physical question. Could the body be kept warm enough to continue? The body is what brings this history close. We can read about medieval architecture, agriculture, trade, and social hierarchy from a distance. But the cold morning returns us to skin, breath, and bone. It asks us to imagine waking before dawn and measuring the world first through sensation. The chill on the nose, the reluctance to leave bedding, the cold floor underfoot, the smoke in the throat, the weight of wool, the dampness in a sleeve, the stiffness of a hand around a bucket. It reminds us that history was lived not only in decisions and events, but in repeated bodily negotiations with the ordinary day. There is something quietly humbling about that. The past often reaches us through what was exceptional. Battles, laws, kings, queens, famines, plagues, cathedrals, manuscripts, and great estates. But most human lives were spent in repetition. Rising, dressing, tending, carrying, cooking, working, mending, waiting, sleeping, waking again. The cold was part of that repetition. It was not always memorable enough to be recorded, yet it shaped memories all the same. A medieval child might remember the place near the hearth where warmth gathered. A servant might remember the sting of winter water before the household stirred. A monk might remember the cold of stone beneath prayer. A shepherd might remember breath rising from sheep in the gray light. A widow might remember stretching fuel too thin. A lord might remember a chamber that looked splendid but never quite lost its chill. These memories rarely survive in their own words. But the material world they lived in allows us to reconstruct something of their pattern. And that pattern was not simply misery. There were moments of relief, even beauty. A fire catching after a difficult morning. Bread warm from an oven. Steam rising from a pot. A cloak dried at last. Sunlight on a south-facing wall. Animals safely fed. Children asleep under shared covers. A feast day brightening the dark season. A neighbor's fire shared when one's own failed. A church candle glowing in winter air. A story told beside the hearth while wind moved outside the shutters. Those moments mattered because they were not guaranteed. Comfort becomes more vivid when it is fragile. Warmth becomes more meaningful when it has a cost. Modern life often hides the labor behind comfort so thoroughly that comfort can feel like a baseline. Medieval life made the labor visible. Someone chopped, carried, spun, sewed, fetched, stirred, watched, patched, fed, and repaired. The warmth of a room was never only a condition. It was the result of care, skill, hierarchy, and work. This is perhaps the deepest reason the subject holds our attention. Waking cold in medieval Europe sounds at first like a simple discomfort, but the longer we stay with it, the more it opens. It reveals housing, fuel, food, clothing, gendered labor, childhood, old age, illness, religion, farming, towns, travel, charity, law, rank, and memory. It shows how a society can be understood through one ordinary physical fact. People were cold, and because they were cold, they built routines, customs, tools, relationships, and meanings around the effort to be less cold. It also corrects a modern misunderstanding. Medieval people did not necessarily think of comfort as the central purpose of life. They valued warmth, rest, food, shelter, and ease, of course. But their world did not promise them as stable rights of daily existence. Comfort was intermittent. Duty was continuous. The body was expected to bear much more direct contact with season, smoke, labor, and inconvenience. That expectation did not make people unfeeling. It made their sense of ordinary life different from ours. And when we compare ourselves with them, the point is not to congratulate the present or romanticize the past. It is to notice the distance. We live, many of us, inside layers of protection that would have astonished earlier households. Insulated rooms, steady heat, artificial light, hot water, dry clothes, private beds, sealed windows, reliable fuel, clocks, alarms, shops, hospitals, weather forecasts. Yet the medieval morning asks a quiet question of us. What parts of our own comfort depend on labor we do not see? Who rises early now so that others wake warm, fed, supplied, and safe? That question brings the past closer without forcing it to become modern. The medieval servant stirring embers, the peasant carrying water, the child gathering sticks, the woman mending wool by firelight, the shepherd walking into frost, the monk crossing a cold cloister, the baker firing the oven before dawn. All of them belong to a world far from ours. But the structure of dependence is not unfamiliar. Comfort still comes from systems. We simply see them less clearly. As the final light of our medieval day fades, the household returns to the same place where we began. The door closes. The room darkens. The air smells of smoke, damp wool, animals, food, ash, and human closeness. The fire gives what it can. The best place near it is occupied. A pot may hang over the embers. Tools rest where they can be found in the morning. Wet things are placed carefully, perhaps hopefully, near warmth. Children grow quiet. An older person shifts beneath a covering. Someone checks the latch. Someone thinks about the weather. Someone looks at the fuel and knows how much is left. Outside, frost may already be forming on the yard, or rain may be gathering in the ruts of the lane. In the barn, animals settle into their own heat and breath. In the fields, the dark lies over hedges, furrows, bare trees, and winter grass. In the manor, servants finish tasks that make comfort possible for others. In the monastery, bells may still mark the hours. In the town, shutters are closed, but cold lingers in stone, timber, alleys, and workshops. All across medieval Europe, sleep approaches not as a clean escape from the day, but as a pause inside a larger cycle. Before lying down, someone tends the fire one last time. Not too much fuel, not too little, enough ash to protect the ember, enough hope that morning will not begin from nothing. This is not a dramatic act, but it is one of the most human in the entire story. It says that tomorrow is expected. It says that discomfort will return, but so will skill. It says that the household has survived this day and is preparing, quietly, for the next. And when dawn comes again, the room will still be cold. The face will feel it first. The hands will search for covering. The floor will wait. The animals will need feeding. The water will need carrying. The work will need beginning. But somewhere under the ash, if the night has been kind and the fire well kept, a small red glow may remain. That glow is a fitting place to leave this world. Not in grand triumph, and not in despair, but in the fragile continuity of ordinary survival. Medieval people woke cold because their world made warmth difficult. They endured it because they had to. They managed it because they were skilled. They remembered it, perhaps, not as history, but simply as life. If there was one detail that stayed with you most, the cold bed, the smoky room, the servant rising first, the wet clothing by the hearth, or the little ember hidden in ash, I'd be interested to hear what felt hardest to imagine living through. And if you enjoy calm, thoughtful history like this, you're warmly welcome to return for the next documentary, where another quiet corner of the past will open slowly, one human detail at a time.